Hello, everybody, and today's lecture is going to be the beginning point of Unit 3, which is going to begin a whole new time period for us in AP World History from 1450 to 1750. And we're going to divide this period of time up into two themes. The first theme is going to be about the development of land-based states. And this is actually going to go fairly quickly. So this lecture is the first of three lectures. And for each lecture, I'm going to be focusing on two states that developed during this period of time. And we're going to focus on very general, broad strokes with each of these different states, emphasizing some of the more important parts. So you could go into a lot more detail, but we're going to kind of look for common themes like we always do through world history. So we're going to start first with West Europe and Russia. And when we look at West Europe and Russia, what we want to first see is that these two regions are expanding as states. So with West Europe, when we talk about West Europe, there's a process of centralization. And what that means is that the European states are going through a process where power is starting to come under a central authority, usually in the form of a king, sometimes, as in the case of England, in the form of a parliament. So centralization means that some central government is starting to assert more control over the country. So the two big countries that we're going to look at are going to be Great Britain and France. We're not going to spend a lot of time looking at all the other ones. We're going to use those two countries to draw this idea of what's happening in West Europe. Because the actual thing about West European expansion is that West European expansion is going to be overseas. And we're going to talk more about West European expansion in Unit 4. So in about 2 weeks, we'll get to that topic. So when we look at West Europe, you don't necessarily have France expanding all throughout Europe. That comes with Napoleon. You don't have Britain expanding all throughout Europe. You don't have Germany expanding all throughout Europe until much later. But for right now, Europe is developing into central states, into a Europe that we would more recognize today. And instead of spending all our time looking at all the countries, we'll just talk about England and France to make life a little easier. On the flip side, we have Russia. Now, if you remember, Russia for a long time was under the control and influence of the Golden Horde of the Mongols. And that's where Ivan III, or Ivan the Great, comes into importance. Ivan III is the Prince of Moscow. And if you remember from last unit, Moscow was increasing in power because they were the ones responsible for collecting the tribute that would eventually go to the Golden Horde. And the Prince of Moscow was using that position to increase the wealth of Moscow and use that wealth to start building up a military. Ivan III is the ultimate benefactor to all of, or the benefactor? Yeah, that's the word. He's the one who ultimately has benefit because he's able to take that built up army and drive out the Mongolian influence. So the big thing to know about Ivan III is that he begins a process of getting rid of the Mongolian influence over the Russian city-states. And if you take a look at the map of the expansion of Russia, and you look at that light purple and then that darker purple, and if you see in the answer key, it says acquisitions to 1505. That represents what Ivan the Great is able to do. The very light purple, that's Moscow. And then Moscow is able to assert greater influence over that darker purple region. And that's part of the process of Ivan the Great freeing the Russian people from the Mongolian tribute system. What's happening is that these Russian city-states are starting to solidify under a central authority, Moscow. And the Prince of Moscow is going to emerge as that central leader. Ivan the Great's successor, Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible, and a well-deserved name, Ivan the Terrible is going to begin a process of expanding south into the steppes area. And if you look on the map again, that's that green to the south. And what he's doing is he's going deeper into the Mongolian holdings. he's expanding Russia and driving out these nomadic peoples. He's bringing these nomadic peoples under Russian rule, and he's doing this for the purpose of protecting Russia. To him, creating this control over this potential invading group is critical to the security of Russia. So, what happens also with this expansion? And that's, I just kind of did little letter B first, or I should have done little letter A. So, little letter A, the growth of the Tsar, the Prince of Moscow begins to identify themselves as an heir to the Byzantine Empire. So, follow me for a second. The Roman Empire is born, and in Rome, you have a Caesar. The Roman Empire breaks up into two halves, a western half and an eastern half. The western half falls in 486 CE or 476 CE. And the western or the eastern part continues on as the Byzantine Empire. So the Byzantine Empire sees itself as the Roman Empire, and Constantinople sees itself as the second Rome. Now, the Byzantine Empire is going to fall apart, and by 1453, there is no more Byzantine Empire. But the legacy of the Byzantine Empire has moved up north to the Russian city-states. And the Prince of Moscow is going to see himself in the same framework as the Byzantine emperors. And he'll adopt a name that's a variation of the word Caesar, and that word is Tsar. Now, if you notice, I have two different spellings. Tsar or Czar. As a little side note, it's not that you need to get like compulsive about what I'm going to talk about, but the idea is that when we take the Cyrillic alphabet and we try and translate those sounds over to the English alphabet, we disagree sometimes on whether or not a sound should be TS or whatever and a CZ. Linguistics argue about this stuff. Linguists argue about this stuff. For our purpose, we want to recognize both as a central ruler of Russia. And that's the key. The Tsar is a central ruler of Russia, born out of Moscow, born out of this driving out of the Mongols. Ivan the Terrible is going to take on that name, the Tsar, and he's going to kind of designate Moscow as a third Rome, as a continuation of that Roman tradition that came through the Byzantine Empire. And then little letter B, I'll just reassert it, the expansion south into that light green area that you see on the map. And I mean, you just need to know that they expanded south. And then we get to this idea of following Ivan the Terrible, this expansion east into Siberia. So beginning with Ivan the Terrible, and then his successors are going to begin this process of expanding Russian control of lands east throughout Siberia. And one of the things that I want you to note is that the Siberian region, they're going to have indigenous people who live there. And these indigenous people are going to be deeply impacted by this development. The indigenous people are going to be exposed to diseases. And if you remember me talking about one of the consequences of connectivity, of interconnection, well, here we have a form of interconnection, the Russian state connecting with Siberia. And one of those consequences of connectivity is the spread of pathogens or epidemic diseases. And in the case of the indigenous people who have never been exposed to some of the diseases coming from the West, this is going to cause massive death and wildfire spread of diseases. The second thing is that for these indigenous people, they're going to go from a hunting and gathering lifestyle to an agricultural lifestyle. As the Russians come in, land is going to be cleared out for farmland. Now, again, we come back to another environmental consequence of interconnection. And then a third impact we'll talk about later, but just to put it on your radar, the idea of religious conversion, cultural consequences. So it's interesting that this information we learned from Unit 2, we're going to start playing with those themes as we go through. And that's something to keep in mind. So that's the first part of Russia and West Europe, this idea of the expansion of states. Russia is going to grow in size. And I apologize for the lighting. I'm right now seeing it's like I'm at a campfire telling you a scary story, but just go with it. So you have this idea that Russia is expanding east and south, and they are growing as a land based empire. West Europe is centralizing, but they're not growing the same way. Their growth is going to be overseas, and we'll talk about that another time. All right. So, administration of the states. So, one of the things about a centralized state is it requires organization and administration. So, when we talk about the concept of centralization, one thing that the central governments want to do is get control of the military. When a central government has control of a military, the military can reinforce the strength of the political central government. If you think about it, and we'll talk about this more in history, if the military doesn't support the central government's got nothing. The central government is just a small group of people telling people to listen to them. But when they have the military to back them up, they have strength. So I think often of 1991, which you guys probably think about all the time. And in 1991, the Soviet Union went through a coup. The hardliners of the Communist Party removed the leader of the Soviet Union. And the leader had been pushing for reforms to the Soviet Union. The people did not take kindly to this grab of power. So the people flooded the streets in protest. And the hardliners sent the tanks out to clear out the people. And the people who were driving the tanks, the soldiers, and said, nah. The leaders had nothing. And the coup eventually falls apart because the leaders do not have the backing of the military. So again, here, when we look at this development of centralization, the military is critical. And what these central governments do, Russia, France, Britain, they put a monopoly on gunpowder. The production of gunpowder, the ownership of gunpowder is going to be controlled by the central government. So here again is an example of a technology that is spread into Western Europe and into Russia, and the central governments have the sense to monopolize it so that they can strengthen their central army, which means that local armies, which had been the tradition of medieval society, are going to start falling apart. The second thing that central governments need is a revenue of taxes. They need to be able to go out and collect taxes. And this is where tax collectors on behalf of the central government become vital. So just keep that in mind that you want to be able to tax local jurisdictions and collect taxes. And that's always going to be an issue for the bureaucracy. Third, the enforcement of central laws. So what happens is the central government is going to put out laws, and then they need to enforce the local authority, to expect the local authority to follow that law. And in the case of England, they're going to use justices of the peace. Justices of the peace are going to go about, interpret law, settle cases, but they're going to be working from a standardized legal system. Likewise, in France, we have this group called the Intendants, and their job was to go out and make sure that people were following the king's laws. And this reminds me of something. One of the things that happens in a school system like Montgomery County is you've got 25 high schools and you've got a central office. And that central office exerts authority over those local jurisdictions. But the question becomes, how do you ensure that what Rockville wants, what the central office wants, is being done at every high school? And that's where you have administrators. Their job is to make sure that the central rule is being enforced. So, for example, one of the central rules is the 50% grading policy. So the expectation is that any assignment that we as teachers enter, the minimum grade you can get, assuming you do the work, is a 50%. Somebody has to look at the grade books of the teachers to make sure that rule is being followed. And that's where the administrators and the resource teachers come in handy. So the central office tells those administrators, you need to enforce the 50% rule. So check each of those teachers' grade books and make sure it's all 50% or more. That's the same thing as justices of the peace and intendants. Lastly, you have a role of the bureaucracy in Russia, England, and France. You have a growing central bureaucracy where you have administrative offices that are enforcing the rules and the regulations of the central government. And as more money is poured into the bureaucracy, the ability to centralize authority increases. So again, we come back to this role of bureaucracy. And what we're seeing in Russia, England, and France is a professional bureaucracy who's paid for by the central government and who owes their jobs to the king or to the parliament or to whatever the central authority is. So therefore, their loyalty is to the central government, not necessarily to the local nobles. And that brings me to the concept of West Europe. So in West Europe, we have this idea that there's a divine right theory. In other words, God placed rulers on earth to rule over the people in God's place. And the idea is that the ruler is only responsible to God. That the ruler has doesn't answer to the people or doesn't even answer to the law. They are there to do one job, which is to provide order and security for the people that they rule over. So therefore, we create a situation in divine right theory where the king is above the law. And the king is the one who makes the law. Now, this divine right theory isn't necessarily true across the board, but it does strengthen the legitimacy of the king. In England's case, they're going to reject the divine right theory. To make a long story short, there's a resistance to this kind of divine right theory. And eventually, England will force the king to sign what's called the English Bill of Rights. And the English Bill of Rights places limits on the king's authority and also preserves rights for the people. And it puts limitations on the government. So when you think about our Bill of Rights, all of our Bill of Rights, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law, respecting the establishment of religion, so on and so forth. And the idea is that, or the freedom, I have to read that again. So the first words are Congress shall make no law. The Bill of Rights is an act of limitation of the central government. And this is where Parliament becomes even bigger for England. Parliament, which is at this point representative of some people, Parliament becomes the central source of power in England. And that puts a check on the king, which leads England to a limited monarchy. In other words, the king does not have absolute power in this situation. However, across the pond, you go to France or across the channel, and there we have absolutism. And in this case, Louis XIV is the name you want to know, the Sun King. The Sun King because everything revolves around him. And the sun is always higher in the sky, and we look up to it. And that's what the King of France was seen as. So in this case, all power rests in the king. The king makes the law. The king makes the treaties. The king is the central actor of the government. So there are no limits on the king's power and authority in France's case. And one of the ways that the kings legitimized their power was by building palaces, sponsoring art. So if you take a look at the palace in the picture, you'll see Versailles Palace, which was the palace of the kings in France, starting with Louis XIV. And the palace was meant to exhibit the power and the grandeur of the royalty of the king himself. And sponsoring such projects to kind of emphasize the strength and importance reinforces this idea of centralization. For Russia's case, we're going to look at two figures. Ivan IV, he is going to go after the nobility, and we call the nobility the boyars. Now, this is a really interesting point because for most of medieval history, the nobility had considerable power. So, to increase central government, you have to bring the local authorities under control. And if you don't get the local authorities to do what you want, you've got to force them to do it then. And that's what Ivan IV was very good at. Ivan IV was very good at imposing order on these nobilities. And that's what led him to his famous moniker, the Terrible, because he was hated by the nobility. So Ivan IV starts that process of centralizing control over the nobles. But the one who really does this is Peter the Great. Peter the Great comes at the late 1600s into the 1700s. And Peter the Great wants to make Russia look more like West Europe. He wants to copy France and elements of English society and bring those Western ideas to Russia and remake Russia into a westernized state. He's going to do this by creating what's called a table of ranks. So here's what he does with the nobility. He brings them under control by ranking them. And the higher up you are in the rankings, the more the czar will be nice to you. So it becomes a way of creating competition amongst the nobility. It's a way of saying, if you're loyal to the state, I'll help you out. And I will give you privilege and access. The second thing that Peter the Great does is he creates the Chancery of the Secret Police. So what he's doing is he's rooting out his political enemies. And this is not going to be a foreign concept to a lot of Europe or a lot of totalitarian states. One of the ways to centralize government is to find out who your critics are and silence them. And if you look at what's happening in Russia today, they really haven't stopped doing this. So this idea of a secret police to root out the political enemies of the central state, this has been going on for 400 years in Russia. And not just Russia, but other nations as well. The third thing, and this is going to help with centralization, is the expansion through war with the Ottoman Empire. So what Peter the Great is going to do is expand Russia's borders. If I take you back for a second to the map, you can see the Russian expansion. I'm sorry, let me just take a look. Kind of this lighter orange, that's all down here. And then some of this lighter orange here into the west. And you have this idea that Peter the Great is looking to use war, which helps to centralize authority even more, to expand the borders. And those new land pickups are going to be the result of the central government's actions, which helps to increase their wealth. And he also builds the city of St. Petersburg, which becomes the capital. And by building St. Petersburg, this is another example of using architecture to legitimize the government, using building projects to emphasize the strength of the state. So St. Petersburg was meant to be a central capital for Russia. I apologize. I'm just adjusting my light. Sorry. Oops, too much. Okay, how's your break? So this idea that Peter the Great is going to create a westernized city and then move the bureaucracy of Russia, move the levers of government to this city is another way that he asserts central authority. And the last thing is I want you to take a look at the picture that I have posted. Here we have Peter the Great standing in the background. He's the one with the black hat, the red jacket, very much dressed like a Westerner. He looks a lot like a British gentleman more than he does a classic Russian noble. And he's going to cut the beard off of a Russian noble. The Russian nobles' beards were kind of a sign of status from medieval Russia. And for Peter the Great to pass a law saying the beards have to go is a way of imposing Western values onto Russia, which increases centralization even more. So we get to belief systems. So the other thing that we want to keep in mind with these governments is that they interconnect and intertwine into religion. So for West Europe, we're going to really simplify things. The basic idea is that in 1517, the gentleman you see in the picture named Martin Luther is going to protest a practice of the Catholic Church called indulgences. Martin Luther is going to call out the Catholic Church for a series of what he perceives to be corruptions. And there's several people who agree with Martin Luther. There's been in the 1400s and the 1500s a criticism that the Catholic Church was becoming corrupted and had moved away from the true religion of Christianity. And his actions are going to spark the Protestant Reformation. What the Protestant Reformation represents is a break within Christianity throughout Western Europe. And we create two camps, a Catholic camp and a Protestant camp. And the Protestants and the Catholics essentially reject each other. So this Protestant Reformation represents a break into the one institution that provided some unity throughout West Europe, the Catholic Church. Now, the Catholic Church is going to try and push back in what we call the Counter-Reformation, where the Catholic Church is going to try and reassert its authority. But by this point, the break is starting to widen, and the gap is starting to grow between the two groups. And that results in several wars of religion. And these wars of religion have a variety of names: the 30 Years' War, the French Wars of Religion. This gets nasty. And the Protestants fighting the Catholics, sometimes Protestants fighting each other. And all of the sides believe that they are enforcing God's will. So there's a religious element to this. It's more than just political stuff. So you want to just know that that happened. Okay, there's a lot more detail I could get into with this, but I'm going to hold myself back. What happens is that government and religion's relationship in the West is going to change. In some cases, government is going to centralize its control over religion. The Church of England is a great example. Henry VIII married to 6 different women at 6 different times, cutting off the heads of 2 of them, divorcing 2 of them, watching one of them die after childbirth, and then being outlived by the last one. There's a lot of great stories I can tell you about Henry VIII. But what Henry VIII does is he breaks from the Catholic Church and he installs himself the head of the church throughout England. And this is, of course, the birth of the Anglican Church, which in America we call the Episcopal Church. So you have this idea that the King of England is also the religious leader of England. And this is an example of further centralization. It also legitimizes his rule because he's saying, I'm representing Christianity within my kingdom. So what he's doing is he's creating a unified system of beliefs throughout his country. In the case of Spain, we're going to have a thing called the Spanish Inquisition. Spain, if you guys remember, was a sort of a mix of Muslims, Jews, and Christians. And in about the 1400s, a centralization starts to take place with the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella. And that marriage is going to create a central government, and they begin to conquer and drive out the Muslim presence within Spain. Soon after that, there's this Inquisition where the Catholic Church, in cooperation with the Spanish monarchy, goes after non-Christians, or they go after people who have they believe pretended to convert to Christianity. And in the end, the Spanish Inquisition is going to drive out the Jewish population. So the Spanish Inquisition there's a lot to it. But one thing is that it shows the government supporting the Catholic beliefs and using the Catholic Church to impose an order throughout Spain to make Spain Catholic and Catholic only. And the second thing is that the Spanish Inquisition is going to reinforce this idea that there's a unity, if you will, under the king to the exclusion of all other groups. For letter C, the politics and tolerance part is the idea that these wars are going on so much that eventually, I'm just checking my time, that eventually there's a need to create some type of peace before this overwhelms society. And this is what leads to a period of tolerance. Basically, the political leaders who start to go, okay, while our country is predominantly Catholic, we're going to put up with the Protestants. And this starts to lead us to a religious tolerance where the two religions kind of work together. Now, here's the big thing is that morality laws are going to start to fall under the view of the government or the purview of the government. So, in other words, the church for a long time took care of laws dealing with marriage, dealing with poverty, dealing with drinking, dealing with gambling. And now the state is going to assume those obligations. Because what's happened is that the church, as a political unity or as a political entity, has diminished in West Europe, which allows the state, the central state, to exert more control in social issues that the church usually took care of. Now to Russia, this gets a little bit easier. Peter the Great, with his interest of centralizing things, takes over control of the Orthodox Church because the Byzantine Empire had always put the emperor atop of the religion. So the legacy of the Byzantine emperor is that, or the Byzantine Empire is that the emperor controls the church. And the Orthodox Church in Russia, Peter the Great says, well, I'm in control of the Orthodox Church. And I'm sorry, there's some people trying to enter my room. The Holy Governing Synod is an example of a central council that tries to rule over the Orthodox Church. And what Peter the Great starts to do is put people that favor his politics in control of it. So in a way, he's kind of stacking the deck so that they will enforce Peter's ideas and Peter's policies instead of following more traditional ideas. So the independence of the church is diminished under Peter the Great. And that leads to a revolt, if you will, a resistance called the Old Believers who reject Peter's reforms and embrace rather the tradition. And eventually the Old Believers are going to commit suicide rather than live with Peter the Great's reforms. So you can see that even though Peter the Great is exerting more control over the church, there's still resistance to that centralization. Lastly, I put up Siberia. As Russia expands into Siberia and comes into contact with the indigenous people, as I mentioned earlier, the Orthodox faith is going to spread with that. And so the indigenous people who didn't die off from the epidemic diseases are going to start converting over to Orthodox Christianity. And then the last thing that I want to mention is this concept of legitimacy. So you have this idea that the rulers need to emphasize to the people that they are the important individual. And to have legitimate power increases your ability to centralize power. Because if you say, I'm entitled to all the power, then all the power flows to you. That increases centralization. So one way to do this is through theory, political theory, whether it be the divine right theory, saying that God put me here. That's what legitimizes my authority. And that we see with Louis XIV, that we see with several monarchs throughout Europe. The other one is just the theory of absolutism, is that the king is the embodiment of the state. And Louis XIV, who is the perfect example of absolutism, famously said, Je suis l'état, or I am the state. So in other words, you have this idea that the political ruler is saying that he is the embodiment of the state. And when a king is saying, I'm the embodiment of the state, then his leadership is unquestionable because he manifests the state. And this is a political theory that lays the foundation for absolutism. Peter the Great has it, Louis XIV has it, several leaders have had it in Europe. Then we also have the use of religion to say that God has approved me. So in the cases of West Europe, where Henry VIII of England says, I'm the head of the Church of England, he's using religion to legitimize his power too, that God has selected him, God approves him. And we've seen that before with other things like the mandate of heaven. And then lastly, and this is important, is the patronage of architecture and art. So if you look at these two paintings that I put up, one of Louis XIV, the other of Peter the Great, both of them are commissioned by the kings. In other words, they pay for it. They patronize it. And they patronize the building of palaces. And what they're trying to do with the art and the architecture is promote a sense of power and a sense of high values. So if you look at Louis, you can see the soldier strength. You see the sword. You see the armor. With Peter's case, you see the cultured nature of him embracing the Western ideas with his mustache, his hairstyle, his clothing. And the paintings that you see are meant to project an image of strength. So whenever we look at art, we always want to keep in mind that art is supposed to reflect something positive about its subject during this period of time. If a king pays for the art, they want to show that they're powerful through the art. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I come to the end. So as always, make sure you bring any questions to class. And that wraps up the first part of our three-part lecture series on the development of land-based empires from 1450 to 1750. In the meantime, you have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.